we started with the end user perspective. We discovered all the limits of this perspective. Then we moved to the designer perspective. We discovered that we can actually design for the good, but then there are also barriers to this, including the business model that is followed by contemporary digital platforms. So we really need to explore also the regulatory perspective that could complement the other two perspectives so that we can succeed in designing for the good. And first of all, I have a question for you. Can we regulate the digital well-being, in your opinion? Is it easy? Is it hard? What are the barriers for this?
The fact that many social media, many apps are international, so also trying to change regulations in Italy or in a specific country in general is not easy to make all the world change.
Yes, there could be contextual factors here playing a huge role. So yes, that's for sure a barrier.
Also, after DeepSeek, like America changed the
Yes.
lots of regulations, which means AI can. There is no privacy anymore in American origin applications.
Okay.
They changed their regulations more like China.
Okay.
And this means for sure policies and regulations shape the technology, whether digital well-being or not.
Yeah. Okay. This is more on the negative side, right?
It would
Because
be like also the government choose the privacy and more, how to say, more in a way positive way for citizens rather than big companies. But now currently it changed in different direction.
Okay.
I have a question. Can we assume that policies and regulations is it kind of governmental policies or just general policies for the companies?
No, here we are speaking more about governance and laws also.
Okay. So if we consider it this side, I think it could be a little bit challenge for the companies because they shape the technologies for their profit, and once they receive some request, kind of political request. So this could be kind of challenge, and sometimes they may stop their services in different countries.
Okay.
We see it from time to time, and that's why I don't think that it works a lot, but
Okay.
sometimes it
Okay.
works. It depends on the agreement.
Okay.
Usually.
Yeah, that's for sure. So in your opinion, should we regulate technology use or should we leave it?
To my mind, it should be, because maybe the government think of the, let's say, kind of the digital well-being of people, and if there are negative sides that they need to, how to say, eliminate or just overcome, and then they may ask for some regulations.
Okay.
So this could be a reason.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, we definitely should, because otherwise, if everything is left free, then I don't believe that the digital well-being space is able to auto-regulate.
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah, exactly. In the past few years, there have been some attempts to introduce some regulation on technology use that is specifically focused on the topics that we have seen during the course. And mainly this is happening in the context of dark patterns, okay? So first of all, a distinction that we made in one of our papers, we can distinguish dark patterns, even attention capture dark patterns, between designs that use deception, so that they are inherently deceptive, like disguised ads and recommendations, and also the usage of fake social notifications. And these, in our opinion, are strong candidates for regulation because there is a clear deception here, right? So it's feasible, although it's not easy, to set standards for what constitutes an interface that deceive users into, for example, a false belief. So you can draw a line. Then there are seductive designs. So designs that tempt the user with short-term satisfaction to, for example, keep the user on the platform, like infinite scrolling. Here we are more on a gray area, right? Because there is no clear deception here. And the harms also depend on the context, on the individual characteristics, on, as we have discovered in the previous lectures, it may depend on contextual factors, backgrounds, and so on. So how can we draw the line between the acceptable, the tolerable, and the truly damaging? That's probably more difficult, right? Anyway, there are some works in the literature that try to bridge the two community, the XCI community and the law community. And for example, in these very interesting papers, they analyzed, they created a taxonomy of arms created by dark patterns, and they discussed those arms in the context of current regulation in Europe. So they studied how this current regulation can support users in avoiding those kind of harms. Of course, there are a lot of limitations. Harms vary and are subjective or contextual dependent, so it's difficult to measure them mainly. And also, as we discussed, these harms can be difficult to avoid due to the attention economy, to the business model that digital platforms follow today. Anyway, we will see a list of current laws and regulations that contains some reference to dark patterns and dark patterns harms. For example, this is the first one. It's European law, the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. And this applies to all business to commercial practices in Europe and in the UK. So it's about commercial stuff, and it covers almost any decision that a consumer has to make while using a digital service or in a physical store. So this range from before using a commercial product, during the use, or after. So it covers marketing, advertising, personalization, and even deceptive patterns. Although the term deceptive patterns, dark pattern, is not explicitly mentioned in the regulation. And the interesting thing is that this directive doesn't require intent, okay? So even if a design is introduced by the company without an explicit intent, but this creates a problem for the end user, this is also modeled by this directive. And this is important because we cannot always demonstrate that, for example, the company introduced the infinite scrolling just to increase money, right? Because again, infinite scrolling is quite a standard in user interface design. But this means that we don't need to demonstrate this intentionality. And there are some principles in this directive that can be related to dark patterns. So for example, the directive forbids any commercial practice that is contrary to the requirements of professional diligence and materially distorts or likely to distort the economic behavior of the average consumer. So Here we can include all those dark patterns that try to steal money from the user. It forbids misleading practices, which involve providing false information or presenting information in a way that deceives the average consumer. And it also models aggressive practices, like aggressive commercial practices. And here we have a more detailed list of these forbidden practices. So if you are interested, you can read them. But for example, we can, the directive forbids bait and switch. So advertising a product at a certain price, then refusing to offer it with the intention of promoting a different product, for example. Or it forbids this way of creating fake urgency. Like when you are booking a flight ticket and then there is this label, 4 seats left at this price, okay? And so on and so forth. Then, as you may know, we have the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, here in Europe. It's a law at the European Union level that sets very strict rules on how organizations, including digital platforms, collect, store, and process personal information. And the aim is to ensure that users have greater control over their information. It mandates transparency, security, accountability, and there are very big fines for non-compliance. And so clearly this can be related, although it's not explicit in the regulation, to data-related patterns that focus on stealing information from the user, like the privacy jackering pattern that we have seen in the first lesson. So again, these first 2 laws are not explicit in referencing dark patterns, but in a way they could be used to support also our goals. Then there are some emerging regulations and policies, especially at the European level, that are more linked in a more explicit way to dark patterns. And the first one is the Digital Markets Act. It's an EU regulation designed to promote fair competition in the digital sector by imposing strict rules on, they called gatekeepers. In another regulation, they use very large online platforms. Anyway, here gatekeepers have been designated by the European Commission, and these were the first 6 gatekeepers included in this regulation: Alphabet, Google, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance, TikTok, Meta, and Microsoft. And there are specific rules for these online platforms under this Digital Markets Act. And the aim is to prevent anti-competitive practices, ensure market openness, and enhance consumer choice. And also here, violations may result in fines up to 10% of global turnover, or in extreme cases, also may result in banning the gatekeeper from the European Union online world. So gatekeepers under this Digital Markets Act cannot, for example, prompt users for data consent after refusal. So if I deny the cookies, for example, you should not ask again the user to accept the cookie policies. Gatekeepers cannot restrict installation of third-party applications, interfere with uninstalling pre-installed apps, complicate data export. I should be able to export my data from my Facebook account, for example. And also make unsubscribing harder than subscribing. Here you can notice a clear link with the attentional Roche model that we have discovered in the first lesson. So there are links with our domain. This is probably the most recent one, the Artificial Intelligence Act. I don't know if you have heard about it. It's an EU regulation that is designed for systems that leverage AI, of course. And the aim is to ensure that these systems are safe, transparent, and respect fundamental rights. The Act categorizes these applications by risk levels, and there are strict requirements and also prohibitions for this kind of systems depending on the risk level. So the AI Act contains provisions that are explicitly linked to dark patterns and manipulative designs. And here are two examples. So for example, Article number 5 forbid AI systems that deploy subliminal techniques or deceptive techniques with the objective of distorting the behavior of the user. So persuasive technology with a bad intent. The same Article 5 forbid practices that exploit the vulnerabilities of a person or a specific group of persons due to their age, disability, or other specific social or economic situation. So we can clearly use this as a regulation against dark patterns. And finally, there is the Digital Services Act. That is another regulation at the European level that supports accountability and transparency for what they call very large online platforms. And this regulation has rules for different domains, including illegal content, misinformation, protecting user rights. And we can also identify here very specific links with deceptive practices. So for example, this regulation requires platforms to implement stricter content moderation, risk assessment, data access for regulators, and the final aim is to ensure a safer digital environment. Yes?
I'd like to ask something. So we say that we have AI Act and
Yes.
Digital Services
Yes.
Act. So how they could be, how to say, just triggered, for instance, by the European countries?
I will show you an example in a minute, okay, about specifically the Digital Services Act. So in this act, there are these very large online platforms, and these very large online platforms must comply with the most significant rules of the DSA. And on April 25, in 2023, the European Commission designated a set of very large online platforms, including different kinds of these platforms, like e-commerce services like Amazon, AliExpress, social media, TikTok, Instagram, and within this act, even other services such as Google Maps and Wikipedia are considered as very large online platforms. And these are some articles as an example of how this act models our domain. So for example, Article 25 forbid providers of online platforms to design or organize or operate their online interface in a way that deceives or manipulates the user. the other example is about explicitly dark patterns. So they mentioned dark patterns in the regulation. Dark patterns on online interfaces are practices that materially distort or impact, either on purpose or in effect, the ability of the user to make autonomous decisions. So they define dark patterns within the regulation. And there are also a list of forbidden deceptive patterns like misdirection, preventing choices in a non-natural manner, nagging. So some of these terms were in the taxonomies that we discovered, I think, during the first lecture. So also the XCI community, in a way, is influencing this kind of new regulations. Obstruction, the same. To answer your question, under these different acts, there are periodical risk assessments and audits on these very large online platforms conducted by the European Commission. And there are also, in this case, very large penalties and fines for those platforms that are not compliant with these regulations. And here is a practical example about TikTok Lite. We concluded the regulatory perspective very briefly, and this was the last perspective in this course. So it's time to move to the last assignment, okay? But before looking at the instructions, the last assignment is about prototyping something. So let's see again very briefly, unfortunately, what does it mean prototyping in XCI. So, no. So what is a prototype in your opinion? Yes?
Maybe creating some interface similar to the existing platforms and let's say describing the kind of text or I don't know, advertisement or some buttons that
Yes?
to show some, to create an example of something.
Okay.
Some platform.
Yes, it's something similar to the real product. It's actually something that looks like the final product, but is not. Okay, so it's completely maybe fake. There are no algorithms, there are no data. You cannot maybe move data from one screen to another. It all is fake, all is fixed, but it looks like the final product. And this is the definition of high fidelity prototype. Then there are different levels of fidelity, but we will discover them right now. So a prototype is a concrete but partial representation or implementation of a system design. It's one of the most powerful tools for design exploration and testing. And prototypes typically let the user see and feel interactivity. So there is interactivity, I can click on buttons, but this interactivity is probably faked. So the goal is to make ideas visible, or also to generate new ideas, testing new ideas, and also to evaluate new ideas. For example, you have applied the heuristic evaluation on a final product, but you can also evaluate prototypes. Okay, so typically in a XCI design process, you start with prototypes, you start testing your prototype, like for example with an heuristic evaluation, to fix issue, and then in an iterative process, you increase the fidelity of this prototype until you reach the final implementation. So there are different tools and techniques for prototyping, mainly according to the stage of the design. So to test an idea, you typically start with a paper-based prototype, okay? Instead, with a high-fidelity prototype, you can start investigating, I don't know, visual details, the UI of the page, buttons, colors, fonts. So we can have different fidelities for our prototypes, and this is an example of 3 different prototypes of the same mobile application. Here we have low fidelity prototypes. Low fidelity prototypes are typically paper-based mockups, so with papers and pens. They are typically black and white, so typically there are no colors. So the design is minimal. It's just and also the interaction, the interactivity is typically simulated. Okay, so clicking on a button means with your finger clicking on a piece of paper, and then there is the researcher that changed the paper-based mockups to simulate the interaction. And clearly this is useful at the beginning. The focus is on the functionality, not on the design, of course. And it's typically used at the beginning of the design process. Then you can move to medium fidelity prototypes, the one in the middle. It's still in grayscale, but it's now on a computer, right? So it's made with a tool on the computer, like, I don't know, Canva, Figma, okay, whatever. Buttons, components in the UI have the right shape, the right font, okay? So here you can start adding some consideration about the visual layout, the visual appearance of the app. And typically there is interaction, okay? So if I click on a button, I'm redirected to another page. And finally, we have a high fidelity prototype, okay? That looks like the final implementation, but maybe it's done on Figma, okay? So it's just visual. There are no databases, no stuff like that, no algorithm, okay? But it looks like the final product. What kind of tool? Yes?
So is it, is it okay to use a different prototype from the one we described in heuristic evaluation? Because in this evaluation, for instance, we were discussing LinkedIn
Yes.
details, but for instance, here we describe something different one. Is that okay? Or?
Yes, probably, but we will discuss these instructions after this set of slides, but yes. Of course, high fidelity prototypes can also be applications, so you can have some code again, but again, most of the critical parts will be fake, okay? So you can maybe design a web application that uses AI for doing whatever, but the AI is not actually there. So there are some hard-coded data just to show how the AI will work in the best case scenario, okay? But it can also be completely visual, like with Figma. So Figma is this tool for rapid prototyping that we already introduced in a past lecture. It's a collaborative interface tool. You can collaborate on a project. It's entirely browser-based, but there is also the application. It's free for students, so you can apply for a pro account. And again, it allows real-time collaboration on the same file. And we clearly do not have time to explore Figma in details. I left here some starting points. from the Figma community. There is a very nice tutorial, but it's like using Canva, right? It's a visual tool, maybe a bit more difficult than Canva, but principles are actually the same. And there is also a video, if you are interested, of a tutorial on Figma that we made during the human-computer interaction course. So then we will see the alternatives you have for the final assignment. Figma is one of these alternatives. So you are free to use Figma to prototype something completely visual. But also Canva is an option, okay? Last time we also discussed our recent work of integrating large language models in Figma to support designers in designing for the digital well-being. If you remember, we had this plugin that allows you to scan an interface and detect some patterns within an interface. And these are some references to create a prototype, if you want, of course, as a plugin for Figma. And the same tool that we have discussed last time is online. So in theory, you could also start from our plugin, modifying it in some way to create a prototype for a new use case, for example. This, of course, you should have some programming skills for this kind of choices, of course, but if you want, you can also try this. And finally, there are some instructions on how to develop a prototype of a Chrome extension. So you are probably familiar with browser extensions. Here are some instructions on how to create an Hello World template for as an extension. So extensions for Chrome are written with the same web technologies used to create web applications, so HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You can access different kinds of APIs, including the Chrome APIs. And here are the ingredients. So you need a manifest file that set up the project, a service worker that can, for example, listen for browser events, like navigating to a new page, or when the user closes a tab. And you can also call Chrome APIs through this service worker. Then there is the third ingredient, that is the content script that can execute JavaScript code in the context of the web page. So for example, you could read and modify the style of the page by removing, for example, some parts of the website. And then there is the pop-up, that is basically the user interface of your Chrome extension. That typically is a pop-up on top of the screen. So through HTML files and CSS, you can style the appearance of the user interface of your Chrome extension. And here are the steps to create an Hello World extension that simply shows Hello World in the pop-up. Okay, and there is also, so here are all the steps, including the steps for uploading the extension on your browser locally. And there is also another example with instructions and the source code for this focus mode Chrome extension, which is an extension that simply removes some parts of the current page to improve focus. So here, for example, this is before clicking on the button on the extension, and this is after. So the extension dynamically removes for example, the sidebar of this page. This could be a useful starting point if you're going to maybe prototype something that, in a way, modify a bit an existing application. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this? Then we will see the specific instructions for the assignment.
So another question: should we try the design, the prototype, both prototype and also extension, or we will?
No. You can decide a strategy. I will tell you now all the details.
Okay. And one more thing.
Yes.
You mentioned that using Figma or Canva.
Yes.
And is it possible to use any other tool?
Yes.
No.
Whatever tools you prefer. Okay. Okay. So last thing from my side is the instruction for the assignment 3. No, sorry. So the goal for the third assignment is, as you may know, prototyping as a group. A digital will be in support. Okay, in theory, it would be better if this prototype is for the same digital service that you analyzed in the assignment 2, but I think you are free also to change your mind and select another digital service if you want. Okay. And here are some possible approaches. The first one is without code. Develop a high-fidelity prototype with Figma or Canva or whatever visual tools you may prefer. Even PowerPoint is fine. Okay. Second possibility: develop a Chrome extension with some code. Develop an extension for Figma that leverage large language models. If you have skills on this, you could maybe try this approach. But you are free to employ any prototyping strategy, including the use of physical objects if you want. Okay. So we know what is a prototype, right? Something that is a representation of a final product. So these are the ideal steps stemming from the results of the second assignment, actually, and your skills. Select a digital well-being problem brought by the digital service you identified in the second assignment. You must be very specific, okay? We don't have time to create a very big prototype, so let's focus on maybe a single violation that you found during the second assignment, okay? If you want to change the digital service, maybe you could very briefly see if there are some important violations in this new service and focus on that violation. So one single problem, then you should decide from which perspective you want to address that problem. If you want to design something for the end user perspective, or maybe something for designers, or maybe something for regulators. Okay, so the three perspectives we have addressed in this course. And then you should, in your group, agree on a technical strategy, on a tool to prototype this solution for the selected problem and perspective. Then, second step, you should brainstorm different ways to realize your solution. And during this, I think, brief discussion, try to make some paper prototypes. Again, focusing on a restricted set of functionality, 1 or 2 maximum, okay? So try to create 2-3 paper-based prototypes, exemplifying your ideas. Maybe you can also create these prototypes individually and then discuss to select which is the best prototype to move on. which is the third step. So make a list of pros and cons for each prototype, paper-based prototype, and select one possible solution. And finally, the longer step, I think, is to translate this paper-based prototype into a high-fidelity prototype, okay? Using whatever tools, physical objects, whatever, okay? Last step, create a report summarizing the previous steps and also including some screenshots of the high fidelity prototypes or some photos if it's a physical object. And then you will be asked to present your work next week. So next week you will still have 2 to 3 hours to complete the work, maybe prepare some slides, and then at the end you will present the work in 10 to 15 minutes. There are no strict rules. You can prepare some slides. You can just speak. The important thing is to make a small demo of your prototype, okay? To show how the prototype works. And here are the instructions for submitting the report. The deadline is next week after the last lecture, okay? So you can also finish your report after the presentation if you want. Any questions? Okay, if there are no questions, I think you can start in your group with the first step. Then if you need any kind of support, I'm here. I will ask you what are you discussing in your groups, maybe towards the end of the lecture.